So I've been invited today to talk to you about financing culture more broadly than only looking at EU funding opportunities, but rather look at the financing mix and then tell you something more about a research project that we are currently working on behalf of the European Commission, DG EAC. So I'm working at the IDEA Consult, a small economic research company based in Brussels, and we advise policymakers, be it local, national, European, in all sorts of domains, among others in cultural and creative sectors. Tell you a bit more about the financing mix that a lot of cultural organizations have in practice. We've talked a lot about public grants now, but often, although they are an important pillar in a lot of cultural organizations, they're mostly only part of their financing mix. And then I'll tell you something more about the potential of crowdfunding, a rather, new, not a new form of finance, but definitely exponentially growing. What is the potential of crowdfunding for cultural organizations? And then I'll tell you something more about crowdfunding for culture, the European project, and Matchfunding. Also something that a lot of policymakers are looking into. How can they match public grants with crowdfunding to leverage one another? I'll tell you more about that. When I talk about financing for culture, I think we always have to keep in mind that although we talk about the group of cultural and creative organizations, we talk about a very diverse group of actors, from very small, often freelancers, to larger organizations, be it active in heritage, but also in music, in film. So the financing needs of this group of actors is very, very diverse. Also meaning that the financing needs and the financial instruments that are relevant for different actors in this group can be very different. Also within their growth cycle, at some point, some type of finance can be relevant. On other occasions, other types of finance can be much more relevant. Looking at the different types of finance that you see, be it grants, local, European, but also donations, loans. Klamer actually talks about you find sources of finance in 3 different spheres. Before the break, we've talked a lot about financing in the government sphere, grants being given to cultural organizations, where you have to apply for, obeying to a lot of rules. The financing is actually provided when you apply for finance in the government sphere. The way you have to apply for it is that you have to make sure that is aligned to the policy priorities. Most grants are there because of a specific societal purpose, and you have to align your application, your argumentation to those priorities clearly. The reporting is also very different than finance in the informal sphere or the market sphere. You have to show the impact of what you have been doing with the public grant. So it requires a specific mindset to attract and get funding from the government sphere. In the market sphere, we talk about bank loans, for instance, equity finance, and there again, the mechanisms are very different. You look at financing instruments that involve a financial return. You have to report in a very different way than when you apply for finance in the government sphere. You have to show that your business plan is viable, that you can indeed pay back your loan, that you can guarantee the return on investment of investors. So this is very different, also requires very different skills from cultural organizations. And then the third pillar that Klamer talks about is what he calls the informal or the social sphere. And there clearly, for instance, donation-based crowdfunding and reward-based crowdfunding is there. What is important in this sphere is actually that you convince financiers, donors, through your story that you tell. What impact do I think or I believe that I create with my project, with my cultural organization? So you appeal to their personal involvement and their belief really in your project and what you want to reach with your organization. So there, again, how you appeal to those financiers is very different. But for cultural organizations, maybe a very powerful thing, because most of cultural organizations have a very strong story to tell, or maybe should be able to tell to their audience, to the public, what they are doing, what is the value of their work, their activities, and this is very important in attracting finance in this informal social sphere. So lots of, when you look at financing landscape, you indeed find in all three of those spheres financing instruments classified in the three different pillars that I mentioned: government sphere, market sphere, informal and social sphere. Maybe just a quick check in the room. The cultural organizations here, how many have really tried to attract finance in this informal or social sphere?
Well, a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
We've got a strategy to start ramping that up.
Okay.
So we're not there yet.
Okay. So, in the market sphere?
Oh, well, yes, loans.
The loans? Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. So, yeah. So indeed, many of the organizations here also show this financing mix, because I guess that you also all have attracted finance in the government sphere. So having this mix indeed. Looking at those three different pillars, public finance is for many of cultural organizations really very important pillar and will remain. Looking at the second pillar, the market, in the market sphere, bank loans. A couple of years ago, we've done a study on access to finance for cultural and creative organizations, also on behalf of the European Commission, in preparation of the European Guarantee Facility, which actually has been launched last week, if I'm correct, finally. Where we asked cultural and creative organizations about the role of external finance, and where we looked into really the barriers, because the guarantee facility is very much focused on bank loans, so the finance in the market sphere. To what extent do cultural and creative organizations really have access to bank loans? What are the barriers? And what maybe the guarantee facility can do about. So looking at the results of the survey that we did at the time, we indeed saw that the government funding is a very important pillar in the finance of cultural organizations, but also that bank and sector-specific loans are important, and that most of cultural organizations indeed have this financing mix. But when we look at the possibilities of bank loans in relation to cultural and creative organizations, We also saw that there are often important barriers to get access to bank loans. A lot of organizations in cultural sector are self-employed, freelance, so they have very hard, they have a lot of difficulties providing guarantees to banks as collateral. The majority of the organizations are really micro enterprises, so having employees between 1 and 5 employees. And a lot of the organizations apparently did not have a business plan, which of course for a bank is a major issue. Moreover, apart from that, when we looked at really the amounts that people were looking for when they applied for, or when they were looking for external finance, was actually that for many of them, the amounts were below 25,000 euros, which also for a bank is often not interesting, if I say it like that. So at the level of microcredits. So blank loans can indeed be an interesting financing instrument in some instances, but in a lot of other occasions, bank loans are not, will not solve your financing problem. So then coming back to those different pillars, the project that we are working on now on crowdfunding is very much in this third pillar on the informal or social sphere. And actually, when we look at the financing landscape, the last couple of years, a lot of things have happened in this, specifically in that informal and social sphere. Crowdfunding, but also venture philanthropy, social impact bonds, impact investing. So there's a lot of things happening of financiers that really look much more or look for this societal impact and how they can really use and invest their money in social impact projects. There has been a lot of attention on crowdfunding, the possibilities of crowdfunding, growth of crowdfunding in the last couple of years, but actually crowdfunding is not so new. Already in the 18th century, Mozart used it to fund a couple of concerts. Of course, it was not through an online platform, crowdfunding platform at the time, but so he tried to reach out to his audience, trying to convince investors about the value of his concerts. And actually he did if we would call it today, a reward-based crowdfunding campaign where he promised that donors that gave him a specific amount of money or invested in his concerts would be eligible for the manuscripts. So he then later on gave it to one of or a couple of donors. So it was really actually a reward-based crowdfunding campaign, although not on in an online platform. What of course makes the rise of crowdfunding nowadays indeed is exponential growth is the technical aspect of it, internet, the development of a lot of crowdfunding platforms, providing a platform where you can reach out not only to your direct family, friends, fools, as they said, in your close neighborhood, but actually to everybody in the world, if you could say it like that. And also what we call kind of cultural disruption, what I also mentioned before, in this informal sphere, a lot of people looking for meaningfully invest their money in something and really want to connect directly with what they are investing in. Looking at the statistics of crowdfunding, well, I don't have to say it here, but the UK is by far the most developed country in that respect, having a lot of crowdfunding platforms raised a lot of money through crowdfunding. There are different models of crowdfunding. I've already talked about the reward-based crowdfunding that Mozart used. There is the donation-based crowdfunding where you actually just donate money, and it depends on from platform to platform. You can donate as of €1, €5, €10. So you don't have to be a big investor, which also makes crowdfunding very attractive to all individuals. You have the reward-based crowdfunding where you do not promise any financial return on the investments, but mostly you give them a kind of present. For instance, when you're in music, often it is when they set up a crowdfunding campaign to make a new album that you get for free the first release, things like that, or you get a ticket of a concert. So there's the reward-based crowdfunding. And then you have the lending and equity. Now, clearly, in looking at cultural and creative organizations, the type of crowdfunding by far most used in cultural and creative organizations is donation-based and reward-based crowdfunding. Looking at the average amounts being raised in the different types of crowdfunding, you do see that there is a major difference between the lending equity type of crowdfunding versus the donation reward-based crowdfunding, where the average amounts are much smaller. In the case of donation-based, reward-based crowdfunding, compared to the lending and equity. When using crowdfunding, what research people that have experiences with crowdfunding all point out. Maybe I have to check, does anyone in the room already has experience with managing or setting up a crowdfunding campaign themselves? No? Okay, good to know. So what people that have done these crowdfunding campaigns give us as feedback is looking at the word crowdfunding, you would think that, okay, funding from the crowd, and as I mentioned, the internet is there and you can actually reach out to the whole world. Actually, in reality, you do see that this crowd is not so anonymous. So it really takes quite some effort to mobilize the crowd if you want to raise money. And often still it begins with the classical family, friends, fools, your close community that you have. But what is interesting is that through crowdfunding, and when you manage really a good crowdfunding campaign, it can easily spread because of the networking effect. And in crowdfunding campaigns, social media is all over the place, so people link to each other, and if people are convinced about the investment that they make in this project, they spread it to their friends, and so your audience, although it's mostly starts with your close community, can really spread out a lot when you manage it. But then the second, that brings me to the second, well, we say misconception in the word crowdfunding. is that most cultural and creative organizations that have used crowdfunding also remark that if you would engage in crowdfunding, you should never do it solely for the funding, for the money. As I showed, the average amounts that people raise specifically in donation-based or reward-based campaigns is limited often. The resources, the efforts that you have to put into it, the team that invests time in managing the campaign, in setting it up, sometimes, if you then make the balance between the money that you raise and the efforts that you put into it, is probably, in the most positive way, neutral. But what most people say when they engage in this crowdfunding, that it is about much more than funding. It is indeed about telling your story. You have this internal exercise of thinking about what are we actually doing? What do we want to? What impact do we want to have? This is also what Jolien stressed when you start your application. You think about what are we doing here? So then you tell your story, and then it's really about reaching out to your audience, make them ambassadors, bring them, involve them much more actively in your practice, and that is really where the added value is of crowdfunding in many cases, beyond the money that you get for a specific project. Apart from that, indeed, also the access to additional finance. I haven't mentioned that, but also indeed this leverage effect, and I'll talk to you about that later, specifically the match funding mechanisms that policymakers are now experimenting with across Europe, where they use or they look at crowdfunding as a kind of market signal for indeed if the audience, it's a very democratic way of looking into what does, for instance, the local community find valuable to put money in, and maybe we as public authorities should follow this line and then match fund projects that are successfully raising money from a specific community to match fund those specific projects. One example, for instance, is in Rotterdam, a campaign that has been set up for the Luchtsingel in Rotterdam. So they actually, you see that it's a neighborhood where there is a railway running through, and they wanted to build a bridge to connect the two parts. And so they have set up a crowdfunding campaign to indeed mobilize the whole community for getting this bridge. About 8,000 funders were there. The architects actually were behind the project. So they raised money to start with, and then when the local city saw about this high community involvement, they actually then decided to finance this bridge. How did the architects go about? So everybody that donated to the specific project got like a wooden pillar in the bridge with your name on it, showing that you have contributed to the realization of this bridge. So this is indeed an example of using crowdfunding to actually get much more than only the initial 60,000 euros. So important indeed is that you think very well about why are you crowdfunding, and maybe the investment as such or the money as such is not the main point, but rather community building or opportunities to realize much more. Looking at literature, critical success factors for a successful crowdfunding campaign is definitely the story. You have to have a good and coherent story to tell to your audience, to convince them why it is really worthwhile for them to put money into your project, and that you can, through your story, connect with them. A team, so there has to be a team that really has dedicated time in running this campaign. Campaigns, they say, ideally run between 1 month and a maximum of 6 to 8 weeks. 8 weeks is actually already quite long because you need to have the momentum. It is a very intense process at that moment, so it takes a lot of resources of your organizations to do this communication campaign. And then, of course, get your supporters involved, starting with your close network of supporters, because of course they are the first ambassadors to get other people involved. And then also very important, a very clear goal. People want to see a very concrete project that they know, okay, this bridge, for instance, I've given my money and this will be realized within this project. They need that much money, and the time to get this money or to raise this money is that long. So also being very clear and transparent about what the goal is of the crowdfunding campaign. But despite the use and the uptake of crowdfunding also in cultural and creative sectors, there's still a lot of questions. Also critique or hesitation to use it. For instance, well, yeah, crowdfunding, maybe it's nice for a one-time shot campaign, but can you go to your network, your audience, every 6 months, every year, or you have to wait another 5 years before you set up a new crowdfunding campaign to raise then another 6,000 euros. So can it be part of a sustainable sustainable financing mix? Is it also a type of finance that is suitable for each and every actor in the cultural and creative sector, or is it actually only for the happy few, larger organizations, or can also individuals make use of crowdfunding? So there's still a lot of questions and really little research on what can crowdfunding mean, how is it being used now, what are the experiences, and what is the potential of crowdfunding for culture. And that is then actually what we are now researching in this specific project, Crowdfunding for Culture. So as mentioned on behalf of the European Commission, and we're doing this with our partners, the European Crowdfunding Network and Ecoris UK. What are we actually planning to do? The study runs until mid next year. So we're doing the research project as such, analyzing data. We have launched 4 different surveys, and I invite everybody here in the room to take the surveys. There are surveys. There is a survey specifically to cultural and creative actors to hear about whether or not they have used crowdfunding, and if they have used it, what are their experiences. If they haven't used it, why they haven't used it. There is also a survey specifically to policymakers to hear about what are the policy initiatives and how do they look at crowdfunding when in their in the whole package of cultural policy development. There's also a survey towards the crowdfunding platforms, hearing about their experiences with hosting cultural and creative projects, the success rates, etc. And then a final survey towards investors, so all individuals. So if you're not part of one of the other three target groups, you're definitely in the, in the target group for taking the survey of investors. Do you invest or donate to cultural and creative projects? And have you ever done it through a crowdfunding platform? Why not? Those type of questions. So you find the different surveys on our website, crowdfundingforculture.eu. So this is all part of the analysis. What we also do in this, or will do in this study is we have also a feasibility study specifically focused on the crowdfunding platforms. Nowadays, or the landscape of crowdfunding platforms is still very fragmented across Europe. You have many small platforms popping up. It's a very dynamic market, but also it is very young, very unstable. So there are a lot of platforms, with a business plan that is not sustainable. Also for investors, but also for people that want to set up a crowdfunding campaign, it is very difficult to choose which platform is the right one for me, to find the information. So also information is very fragmented. And what we will look into in this feasibility study is to what extent does anything has to be done about this fragmentation, or is it just fine the way it is? It could be also an outcome, or should there be anything that policymakers at whatever level should do to overcome this fragmentation. We have set up now a light version already of the website, which will further grow when we continue in the project. So I mentioned crowdfundingforculture.eu, which by the end of the project has the aim to become a kind of central information hub at European level for all people interested in crowdfunding for culture, where they find information, for instance, the results of this study, but also links to other studies that have been done on this, organizations, relevant platforms. For instance, now already on the crowdfunding platform, but this is still a beta version, so we're still working on improving it. For instance, you find a platforms map where you can select in different countries what are relevant crowdfunding platforms that have until now hosted projects of cultural and creative organizations. Being some of the platforms have a more general profile, so they host, among others, cultural and creative projects. Some of them are very specifically focusing on hosting cultural and creative projects. Some of them even very specific niches, like for instance in Belgium you have Sandawe, which is a crowdfunding platform that is really specifically focused on crowdfunding projects for comics. And they only host this type of projects. And you have similar platforms across Europe focusing specifically on heritage or music. So you find that information already there. So, but this is work in progress, the website. And I've talked about that. So the 4 different groups that we look at in this project. and research. Now, as I mentioned before, crowdfunding as such is an interesting tool or instrument to raise money and far beyond money, do things in your organization or get things moving in your organization. But also an interesting evolution that we see across Europe is that many policymakers are looking into the crowdfunding as a way of leveraging public grants. For now, not yet in the Creative Europe program, but also in the UK. A couple of months ago, the Cultural White Paper has been has been presented, where they also announce to look into this matchfunding mechanism, and then later on they have indeed launched a call for a platform to host a number of pilot initiatives, 5 initiatives, to see indeed what could this matchfunding mean. Now, what matchfunding models do we see across Europe? There are different ways. Nesta has here or talks about those 4 different models. In first, where the government decides to grant a specific amount, and that the organization is actually obliged to top this grant with crowdfunding money. The other way around is the top-up, where if you are successfully, if you have successfully raised a specific amount, that public authorities then say, okay, if you successfully raise a specific amount, then we top it up, because this is a strong market signal and we want to support it. The bridging model is something in between, so they say, we give you a basic grant, you set up a crowdfunding campaign, and if this appears to be successful, we want to add some more of public grant. And then finally, the real-time matchfunding model, where public government says for every euro that an individual grants to your project, we will give another euro. You have these different types of models being used, being experimented with, because, as I mentioned, this is rather new, and a lot of policymakers are looking into this, setting up experiments, but often indeed they are still in an experimental phase. One interesting model that that we see in Sweden is, for instance, Crowdculture, where there you don't really have a match funding, but there the mechanism is that individuals pay a fee of €5, and then they can vote. So actually they buy a vote. Different projects are being presented by cultural organizations, and you as an individual, you can vote what is for you the most valuable or most interesting project to invest in, and the government then follows this this voting, and then decides about how to allocate their funding. So actually they use the democratic votes of their community to decide upon their. Voordekunst.nl is, I think, the organization that has probably most experience in managing match funding programs. I think they have over 10 programs for now, having or managing the matchfunding programs of city level, provinces, but also they for instance manage a matchfunding program for ABN AMRO, which is a traditional bank, but has an agreement with Voordekunst.nl as well. So very diverse types of matchfunding programs that Voordekunst.nl is managing nowadays. Then another example here locally is the London Mayor's program. This is not specifically focused at culture and creative organizations, but very much on urban regeneration and community building, but often you see that cultural and creative organizations are involved in these type of projects. Also here the mechanism is that the program co-funds projects that can successfully raise money through crowdfunding as well. So this is all what we are going to research in our project. I suggest to follow us and see what comes out of it. And again, I invite you to take the surveys and share your opinions, your experience with crowdfunding and the financing mix. Thanks.